Welcome to the Politics of Information webinar series, organized by the Center for Access to Information and Justice at UWinnipeg, featuring speakers who research surveillance, data, and power in the digital and pandemic age. The Center for Access to Information and Justice focuses on public interest research and the use of access to information in social science. Check out the CAGE website for more. I'd like to acknowledge that the UWinnipeg is located on ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. And I acknowledge that our water in Winnipeg is sourced from Shoal Lake 40 First Nation. Thanks to the UWinnipeg media team for working on the CAGE webinar series. Here's the format for today. We have a total of 75 minutes. We have our featured speaker, and if you have questions, please put them into the audience Q&A tab. Now to introduce our featured speaker, Dr. Saher Selod is Associate Professor of Sociology, Simmons University in Boston. Her first book, Forever Suspect, Racialized Surveillance of Muslim Americans in the War on Terror, Rutgers, examines how Muslim men and Muslim women experience gendered forms of racialization through their hypersurveillance after 9/11. And her co-authored book, second book, A Global Racial Enemy, Muslims and 21st Century Racism, examines how the global war on terror has justified the detention, imprisonment, and hypersurveillance of Muslims in countries across the world. And she's also currently the director of research at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. Thanks for being here today, and the floor is yours for your presentation.
Thank you so much, and I really appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to speak to you all today about this very new research. The book is just now out, so this is one of my first talks on it. So please forgive if it's not as, it's the first time. So I'm excited and a little bit nervous to present on it. So today I am going to talk to you about surveillance and the global war on terror. So what the book is titled is A Global Racial Enemy, which I'll show you an image of it, Muslims in 21st Century Racism. And I start with this moment because this is what all of my research really is about. It's stems from the terrorist attacks on September 11th, 2001, in the United States. And so this happened prior to me starting my graduate program at Loyola University Chicago, and it just completely shifted the lives of Muslim Americans and even Muslims, non-citizens living in the United States. So in graduate school, I was really interested. I was, interested in race and racism and trying to situate the Muslim experience within this body of scholarship. I ended up conducting a study of 48 Muslim American men and women, all who were South Asian or Arabs living in the United States and who had citizenship. And so it ended up in this book, Forever Suspect, which I published in 2018 with Rutgers University Press, where what I uncovered was that the ways in which Muslims were experiencing racism in the United States were the result of the surveillance that they were encountering. So in this book, I organize it into three thematic areas. The first is state surveillance that Muslims encounter in this book. I have a chapter called Flying While Muslim, which highlights airport security and the ways in which Muslims, felt like they were encountering hyper-surveillance in US airports. Another chapter focuses on the way citizens participate in surveillance. So citizens are armed or encouraged by the state through a program called If You See Something, Say Something, to watch and monitor any kind of suspicious activity. And an effort initially, If You See Something, Say Something, was about preventing another terrorist attack. And as a result of this, I found that Muslims who are aware of their hyper-surveillance start to surveil their own behavior. So this book was focused on the counterterrorism policies in the United States and the impact that this was happening on Muslims living in the United States. And so the data was collected between 2009 and 2012. And since then, it has encouraged me or inspired, the second book that I'll talk about today, but also an ongoing research project that I'm working on right now, which examines the ways in which African American, Black immigrant, South Asian, and Arab Muslims are dealing with and encountering not only federal surveillance, but also policing by local law enforcement. So happy to talk about that in Q&A if anybody's interested. But I just want to start with this understanding and notion that, Muslims were not racialized after 9/11, but had been experiencing racialization well before the September 11th attacks. So for anyone who is familiar with Edward Said's work, he wrote in Orientalism about how, Europeans, the construction of knowledge about, Arab countries by Europeans was done without ever having, been to these countries. So, Orientalism is really about this, creating the other. And he looked at, literature and art and how it essentially socially constructed Arabs and Muslims as barbaric, misogynistic, all the things that we see in terms of the ways in which Muslims are racially, socially constructed today. Neo-Orientalist logics of the global war on terror is what we focus on. So we talk about Orientalism in the co-authored book that I'm going to talk about today. And Neo-Orientalism is sort of taking from Said's notion of Orientalism and discussing, scholars have written about how, we can look at this in terms of it's a 21st century form of Orientalism. And the shift really is on focusing on Islam. And so this notion that Islamic theology is the focus of Neo-Orientalism and that it's incompatible with nations' values and visions. And this will become apparent in what I will talk about with global counterterrorism policies. So, and it also allows for analysis of gender, something that in Said's book we see is not analyzed as much as it should have been and could have been. So what are some of the stereotypes that racialize Muslims? One, that Muslims are foreigners, regardless of how long they've lived in any of the countries that we study. Muslim women are abused. Muslim men are abusive, violent, barbaric, they're terrorists. Islam is not modern, it's an antiquated religion, and Islam does not belong within the nation state. So in A Global Racial Enemy, what we identified was that not only are Muslims marked as a threat to national security, they're also marked as, culturally transgressing the sort of values of the nation state. So this is where we see gender really playing an important role in the racialization of Muslims globally. Excuse me. So the book outline, this is the book, I co-authored this with Dr. Inash Islam and Dr. Steve Garner. And this is, what we how we examine the global racialization of Muslims. So there's the introduction where we, really go over our theoretical framework, which is examining how the global racialization of Muslims using India, China, the UK, and the United States as examples of how we see this occurring. And to be clear, this is something that's occurring in many, many countries. These were just the 4 that we decided to use as our case studies. And so in this chapter, we talk about how surveillance and the hyper surveillance and the increasing surveillance and surveillance industry and securitization is directly tied to the global war on terror, and that relies on the construct of Muslims as a threat, so this racialization of Muslims. And we also discuss in this chapter how we employ an intersectional analysis. So not only are Muslims racialized, that this racialization is also deeply gendered. So we also look at Muslim histories. It's really important when you're looking at these four very distinct contexts to situate Muslim histories in each of these countries. So one thing that I want to note is that Muslims have a long history in all of these countries. So in the United States, for example, some might think that, Muslims migrated they're new immigrants to the United States. And certainly this is what we see in terms of a nationalist and populist sort of ideology that's presented, is that Muslims are these new invaders to each of these countries. But Muslims first came to the United States through the system of slavery. So, it's really looking at how Muslims have existed in these countries for a long time. We examine media representations. We look at the rise in, state authoritarian nationalism versus, populism and ethno-racial populism in the United States and the UK versus, a rise in nationalism in India and China, and how they are constructed and in terms of, in relation to the racialization of Muslims. So, but today what I'm going to talk about are the counterterrorism policies that each of these countries are employing and how they're reliant on this racialization of Muslims. So I just want to start with, why we're seeing counterterrorism policies globally. And one of the things that occurred after 9/11 was that the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 1373 on September 28th, 2001. So just a few weeks after 9/11 had happened. And if you look at the records, I believe the meeting lasted a total of 10 minutes, in which they determined that every country that was a member of the United Nations was required or mandated to engage in this global war on terror domestically through their laws and policies. So it really, we started to see countries put into place counterterrorism policies because of this mandate. So every country was told that they had to, fight terror. It's a new type of war that we've seen with the global war on terror. So one example of how we see, not only different countries participating in this global war on terror, but also how countries are mimicking one another's counterterrorism laws and policies. So these counterterrorism policies that are being created in countries with different histories and different, different issues of terror or terrorism, different threats of terrorism in their country, in their individual country, are still utilizing counterterrorism policies created by other countries. So this is an example of this, is that in 2004, filmmaker Theo van Gogh was brutally murdered in the Netherlands. He had been making films that were, that we know were very Islamophobic in the ways in which the messages that it was giving. So Moroccan Dutch Muslim man murdered him as a result of the films that he had been making and the anti-Muslim and Islamophobic sentiments he had been perpetuating. In the Netherlands, there had not been this, there had not been many terrorist attacks. And so, but as a result of this one instance, of this one murder, they put into place a counterterrorism policy known as preventing violent extremism, where the state was coming up with ways to prevent radicalization within its population, mostly targeting a Muslim population. So this happens in 2004. And in the UK, the government creates Prevent, which is modeled off of preventing violent extremism that was created in the Netherlands. So you see that there's this copycat counterterrorism policies that start to get created in other countries. So the Netherlands creates preventing violent extremism. The UK models Prevent, which is where the state, encourages teachers, social service organizations, all kinds of um, institutions to, really identify any kind of radicalized behavior to prevent terrorism. So in 2009, President Obama, rolls out Countering Violent Extremism in the United States, which is modeled after Prevent and Preventing Violent Extremism. So you see that these counterterrorism policies are really related to one another. In the United States, Countering Violent Extremism is a program where organizations could apply for federal funding, and then they were responsible for identifying and weeding out any kind of radicalization within their communities. So it's getting communities to surveil themselves. That was how it was first rolled out. Where I live, Boston, the Islamic Center applied for this grant to watch its own congregation of Muslims to weed out any radicalization. So this was initially intended to target Muslim radicalization and white national radicalization in the United States. But what we've seen in the years since it's been in place, and depending on who has been president in the United States, that different organizations like hospitals, schools, universities, and even Boston, police unions have gotten this funding, and in some cases have specifically targeted Muslims for surveillance. In the United States, after after 9/11, we saw a few policies that were put into place. There were actually several policies, and this is just a few that I want to highlight here because these really, we can see, have influenced counterterrorism policies in the countries that we focus on in our book. So NSEERS is the National Security Entry Exit Registration System. And what NSEERS did was it required non-citizen men who were age 16 or older, who came from one of 25 countries, they had to register with the state. So Bush put this into place right after 9/11, and it wasn't terminated until Obama was president. So what this did was it created a registry of these non-citizen men. 24 of the 25 countries were Muslim majority, regardless of the United States relationship with that country. So these were not all countries that had, hostile relationships with the United States. In fact, some of them are considered the United States allies, yet they are all Muslim majority. So this, in the United States, we started to see a Muslim registry of Muslim non-citizen men. So this is something we see in other counterterrorism policies in the countries that I'll talk about in a few minutes. But also another major shift in the United States came about because of the USA Patriot Act. And the USA Patriot Act was written before 9/11, but it was passed within weeks after 9/11. It's a 200 plus document, which really greatly increased the United States government's ability to surveil non-citizens, but then we've seen it's included citizens of the United States. So some of the things that happened were it allowed for like secret evidence, for example, to be used to collect information and build a case against people, especially if it was done to prevent a terrorist attack. So what we wanted to show in this chapter is that these counterterrorism policies are, we see them being employed in all of these different spaces and different places, but they're used differentially. So what we see in the United States and the UK is very different than the ways in which we're seeing India and China employ their counterterrorism policies. In the UK, we see that the Terrorism Act of 2000 and 2006, these are two different acts, have been passed. And some of what it has allowed for are stops and searches at the border. This is similar to what we see in the first book that I wrote, what we see with TSA at US airports, that Muslims are stopped and searched regardless of if they make the metal detector or a body scanner go off, that, they're targeted for surveillance in airports. So in the UK, according to a Cage report in 2020, Muslims were stopped over 88% of the time. And here we see that they're interrogated, fingerprinted, in some cases, DNA samples are taken, and their phones and computers are checked. And so it's very similar in some ways to NSEERS in the United States. So we're seeing, sort of similar practices and policies happening in different countries. Another one is preventative policing that's under these acts, which is it's lengthened the detention time for anyone suspected of a terrorist activity, and it's also using secret evidence. So what this means is that people don't know what type of evidence the government has collected on them, and their lawyers actually aren't allowed to know what kind of evidence the government has against them. And this is all protected because the government has made this claim that it would, threaten national security to reveal how, what kind of information or how they're collecting this information. But it's really resulting in extreme human rights and civil rights abuses for Muslims. And so this was, something that we saw in the USA Patriot Act as well. In China, which is a very different context. So I just want to make it very clear that in the book we do address the fact that these are very different contexts. What we see, particularly in 2017 and 2018, is a shift towards employing counterterrorism policies, especially those that are targeting Uyghur Muslims. So in this regulation on De-Extremification Act, you can see here, this is an image of a camp in China where we see Uyghur Muslims, mostly men, are being held. And so the regulation on De-Extremification Act, which was passed, I believe, in 2017, has multiple articles in it that sort of make anyone who is, openly Muslim, that is considered an act of being an extremist. So religion, one of the articles is that religion has to be compatible with the socialist society. Wearing or forcing someone to wear the burqa, spreading religious fanaticism through regular beards or name selection. So we really see just, for Uyghur Muslims, just the act of being a Muslim is enough to result in their detention in these camps. And I'm happy to discuss more. Darren Byler has written amazing work about this, that, what he calls this is terror capitalism, because we see sort of an economic reason behind, the sort of displacement of Uyghur Muslims in the Xinjiang region, and also that we're seeing them being forced into forced labor in these camps. So that's something to think about. But I had mentioned that we really take an intersectional analysis, and I did that in the first book as well, bringing in gender. So in China, we're also seeing the surveillance and policing of intimate relationships. So the Pair Up and Become Family program is one that the government has instituted, where because of, so many Uyghur men being detained and being put into these camps, that the women who are left behind are being forced into these relationship with Han men. And so what's really occurring, and what Sean Roberts talks about in his work, is that this is a form of settler colonialism, of displacing a Uyghur population from this region and replacing it with a Han population. And so we see here that it's not just, men who are put into, who are physically detained as threats to the nation state, but that in this case, the Pair Up and Become Family program really relies on that notion that, well, Uyghur Muslim women are going to produce Muslim children, and that this could be a threat to the nation. And so this is just, again, an example of how in China it's much more extreme than what we see in the United States and the UK. However, in India, we're also seeing with the rise of Hindutva ideology and a hyper-nationalist government that some counterterrorism laws and policies are being enacted in this space as well. So the UAPA, which is the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, which is considered their, anti-terrorist act, broadly defines terrorism. So it's so vague and broad that it's being used extensively on multiple different populations. So it's allowing for warrantless seizures and searches, detention without being charged for 180 days. There was the provision of the Prevention of Terrorism Act of 2002, which was modeled after. So you can see here the ways in which counterterrorism policies influence one another. So it's modeled after the USA Patriot Act. And even though it was repealed, we're seeing provisions of it being embedded under the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act. And so really it's being used against the protests that we're seeing in India against some of the Hindutva ideology and practices there. And so in India, we're also seeing love jihad. So this sort of ideology that Muslim men are forcing Hindu women to convert, making it, some states, especially in Uttar Pradesh, are sort of, perpetuating this myth that Muslim men are forcing Hindu women to convert and marry them, which is called love jihad. So you see here that this resulted on the left of a brutal attack on a Muslim man who was had a relationship with a Hindu woman. And so there are multiple cases of this, even though the Supreme Court in India did rule in one case that there was a case that went up to the Supreme Court that the Muslim man did not indeed force a Hindu woman to convert and to get married. But again, the state, especially under these hyper-nationalist, sort of governments, are surveilling and policing intimate relationships in this way. So ultimately, what we are arguing is that the global racialization of Muslims relies on the definition of racialization that I provided in my first book, which is the process by which bodies become racial in their lived realities because of biological and/or cultural traits as a result of the intersection and cooperation between ideologies, policies, laws, and social interactions, resulting in the denial of equal treatment in society. So in the United States, and when I was in graduate school, it was very difficult to use race scholarship to talk about the Muslim experience because back in 2009, most of the sociological scholarship on race was really looking at the experiences of African Americans and whites in the U.S. as a result because of slavery. And so here, what we're arguing for, and what I've been arguing for in a lot of my work, is that Muslims are raced in different ways. It's not just about phenotype and skin tone, but indeed it's about cultural attributes. In the case of airport security, it's a Muslim name, and we know that in the United States, the TSA is relying on the FBI terrorist database, which was, hugely supported by the USA Patriot Act financially. And if we think about that policy and Sears, where Muslims are registering Muslim men, we can kind of get an idea of who is on these FBI lists because they won't release how these lists are created or maintained. But it's so Muslim name in this sense that, results in somebody's racialization and marks them as a potential threat, resulting in their hyper surveillance in the United States, in the UK, in China, and in India. So I just want to, stop with end with a few conclusions. One that's not on here that I think is important to realize is that while we see these counterterrorism policies being employed or created under the notion of protecting the nation from any kind of threats of terrorism, whether it's actual physical threats or these cultural threats or threats to the ideology or what the nation means, or what it means to be a part of a citizen or a member of the nation, that we know that these counterterrorism policies are actually targeting a much larger population than just Muslims. So, for example, in the United States, although we see a lot of these counterterrorism policies being promoted in preventing terrorism, they're actually being used at the border to target and surveil undocumented people. They're being used through fusion centers, which are a counterterrorism center that was meant that multiple states in the United States have, including Boston. They were initially created to weed out terrorism, after 9/11, but when they didn't find any terrorist threats, we know that they're being used to police Black and brown neighborhoods who are not Muslim. So, the expansion of these counterterrorism policies is very, very large, and goes beyond just a Muslim population. But in terms of Muslims, we see the racialization of Muslims as a global project. So, we're used to thinking about, race and racism as something about the West versus the rest. But when it's being employed in places like India and China, the goal is not to, the goal is not in service of white supremacy. And so, although counterterrorism policies may employ racial logics that favor whiteness or that were created in that sense, that they're not being used globally in this way. Counterterrorism policies are gendered and racialized and have gendered consequences. So Muslim women have very different experiences from Muslim men, and our counterterrorism policies impact them differently. So this is the same for policing. When we look at, how individuals are policed, so flying while Muslim is, derivative of driving while Black in the United States, that we know that Black women have differential experiences. So Beth Ritchie wrote a wonderful book about the prison nation and what Black women go through in the United States. It's similar, that we have to take into account the ways in which these policies are not only racialized, but they're very much gendered. And the one thing that I might just want to leave you with is that we do have in our conclusion that racialization, when we talk about it, it's never just about, people losing agency, but that there is a lot of resistance. And particularly in this moment, I think that we're seeing a lot of resistance globally around anti-Muslim racism. But we do need to think about the counterterrorism policies, because a lot of people are not aware of how these counterterrorism policies, what they are, that they exist, and that they're driven or created on the notion of racializing Muslims. But we do end the chapter looking at, in each country, how racialization is met with resistance. So one example I want to give you is the Muslim Justice League in Boston, that does a lot of work around countering the surveillance programs that are being employed or funded in the city of Boston. So there is work that is being done to resist this. So I will stop there, and I so appreciate you all taking this time to hear this. Thank you.
Thanks so much for your presentation, and thanks for going into these issues courageously and investigating them at a time when I think critical scholarship on this topic is sometimes suppressed or also targeted by the same kind of racism.
Yeah.
So if you're in the audience and you have some questions, you can pop them into the Q&A chat, and we'll just see them pop up on our side. And I have a few questions just to start out. Could you say a little bit about the relationship between these policies and these surveillance practices in the United States and in China, and specifically with the Uyghur Muslim population? Because I think a lot of people just assume these are such totally different political and legal contexts. But then when you look at it, it's kind of like Silicon Valley meets counterterrorism, war on terrorism 2.0, or it's just a different version of it. So can you reflect on some of the continuities?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And I think that the case of China and the United States in terms of state level relationships is very complicated, because I just want to make it clear that, when Trump was running for president in the United States, he ran on a very anti-Muslim campaign, right? So in the US, in 2016, he was saying, I'm going to ban Muslims, I'm going to register Muslims, even though we know this has all it's all been happening in the United States if you study counterterrorism laws and policies. And yet, when he became president, Pompeo was critiquing China for the ways in which they were treating Uyghur Muslims. And so lots of people are like, well, why, how do these contradictions make sense if you understand what the deeper motivations are behind these counterterrorism policies? So on a state level, we see the United States sort of critiquing China. And in fact, I believe it was Bush who when China and when Bush started to engage in the war on terror, China wanted to start doing some of that, and they said, no, we don't, don't do this. But yet, what we see here are corporate connections between the United States and some of the surveillance technology being utilized in China that's been used against Uyghur Muslims. Or one of the forms of resistance that we talk about in the conclusion is people, who are protesting New York's Fashion Week because of the, clothes that are made in these camps, for US companies, for example. So there is a relationship between the United States and what these counterterrorism policies have produced, which is essentially these labor camps too. So a lot of the products that are based in from US companies are using Uyghur labor to make those products. So the relationship though from the state level is not as clean cut as it is like maybe from the US, the UK, and the Netherlands, who are all like talking about this. China's a little bit different, but there is definitely, like you said, from Silicon Valley, that's a good analogy to the camps or to Uyghur Muslims, the experiences of Uyghur Muslims. We're certainly seeing like from, there was a company in Massachusetts, for example, that was doing some work with China around DNA testing. And when it was, when somebody highlighted the fact that they were being used on Uyghur Muslims, then I think Darren Byler talks about this in his book, that, then we saw that they were like, they discontinued that relationship or whatever, but there's certainly those relationships for sure. Yeah.
Can you say a little bit about the continuities between China and India as well? I've been reading about in India the transit surveillance and how the transit surveillance is sometimes connected to this kind of neo-Orientalist or anti-Muslim surveillance, and how it's also connected to like facial recognition and very automated forms of surveillance.
Yeah. So I probably don't have as nuanced of an answer as I would like to have, but in terms of the relationship between China and India, but we know that India has been hosting, via the UN, and I think it speaks to what you were just saying about the facial recognition and the tools of technology that are being developed and used to surveil, that they recently hosted a conference around the tools of technology being used to combat terrorism. And certainly China has sort of been, leaps and bounds ahead in terms of the surveillance tools and technologies that they've been using, right? And so we know that, like, for example, their ability to determine where somebody is, like if, for Uyghur Muslims, if they've, stepped out of line or left an area that they weren't allowed to go into, that they can tell just from their phones, tracking them on their phones and the types of technology that they have there. So certainly we're seeing a lot of that, through these conferences that are occurring, and India has definitely been leading some of these conferences that are, through the UN about these tools of technology that China, for example, has done. So it's not, and it's not just them, right? It's also like, utilizing surveillance technology through border fences in India that are being used, that have been used in Israel, for example. So we're seeing this, just really it's a global surveillance industrial complex. It's not a, you know, it's not just one country, but they're learning from each other and sharing with each other and whatnot. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, I was going to ask if you could say a little bit about whether there is an equivalent to NSEERs in these other countries that you studied or that you've learned about subsequently in any other countries, like this kind of database that almost fosters statelessness or precarity among Muslim persons.
Yeah. So I know that in China, they are collecting DNA samples. So it goes beyond like the United States. And I think in the UK, that example was also of like potentially, getting DNA samples. And that's just something like in the United States, like it was fingerprinting, interrogating, and photographing. But the collection of DNA samples is just another, looking at biosurveillance. Like we're starting to see some of this. So I'm not exactly sure what other countries have been utilizing it, but that's something worthy of investigation. I mean, I do know that like, for example, cities in the United States or Canada are participating in, these counter-violent CVE types of conferences, with each other. And some of them are happening in Iraq, with cities in Iraq, Pakistan has CVE, for example, but certainly I feel like if, we're seeing these counterterrorism policies, we're obviously going to start seeing, there must be like these database collections, including DNA samples and things like that, just beyond like photographing, interrogating, and fingerprinting and things like that. Yeah.
Yeah. When one goes through like the web pages or the brochures of some of these technology companies, they make it sound like their digitization and automation of surveillance is going to end racism. Uh, have you studied the ways that racialization and racial bias is like coded into some of these surveillance practices?
Yeah. So not as in depth as people like, I don't know if you've ever looked at Ruha Benjamin's work, who talks about like, in a different way, but like how algorithms and technology, is racialized, but we know that like the facial recognition, for example, uh, is just even the way it works is racially problematic. So Boston, for example, was going to the BPD, Boston Police Department was going to utilize facial recognition technology, and we know that it couldn't even accurately identify darker skin people, so a lot of these tools of technology are being used are created based off of whiteness, So that actually was stopped by, I believe it was like the ACLU and some other maybe even some other advocacy organizations around facial recognition being deeply racialized and problematic. So yeah, absolutely. These tools of technology that are being used are deeply racialized, and we need to be very cognizant of that. So there's no way it's eliminating racism. It's just going to perpetuate racism, and that's the thing that like my work really focuses on, is that surveillance is never colorblind. It's always deeply racialized. Whether it's in the tools of technology that are being used, and or the laws and policies, and in the ways in which people are trained to look for suspicious behaviors and what they identify as suspicious behaviors. So in the case of the global racial enemy and forever suspect, suspicious behaviors really are being Muslim. For Muslims, it's just the act of practicing Islam becomes suspicious in and of itself. So we really should be very cognizant of how these tools and the practices are racialized.
Yeah. Um, in terms of other sites where you want to take your research next with this theoretical framework, uh, what are you thinking about today? What kinds of sites are heavy on your mind today in terms of advancing this research?
Yeah, so I will say I'm, a qualitative researcher by nature. I think I really love interviewing people. I feel like, it's um studying the laws and policies and but then seeing how they actually impact people is so important to see what it's like on the ground. And so for the second book, we really looked at it was a macro analysis and not like via qualitative interviews. I think I would like to do qualitative interviews to see, here are the laws and policies we know have been put into place. Well, what is it actually like? Now, it would be very difficult to do that in some of these spaces, but I would really, really like to see you know, what the impact is on the everyday lives of people, particularly around these gendered sorts of, policies that are being put into place, like love jihad and you know, pair up and become, I mean, these are really horrific, policies when you think about it, particularly pair up and become family, forcing these kinds of, relationships on Uyghur Muslim women. So that's one thing. And then the other one is like the project that I'm doing right now on where I've been interviewing African American, Black, immigrant, and South Asian and Arab Muslims in the United States. And one of the things that's really fascinating is seeing how the war on drugs and the war on terror, for example, are so deeply interconnected, and how there's a lot of research, particularly I know in like criminologists and criminal justice departments, and especially as we've seen a lot of people protesting in the United States, like the racial profiling by the police. But missing in this analysis is the role of the war on terror on this. So, this is something that I think also warrants a lot of attention is, on the one hand, people might support making the country safer or counterterrorism policies, thinking that, that's something that, would make them feel safer on airplanes, airports, or wherever. But then on the other hand, especially in a city like Boston, I'm seeing, people be like, I don't believe in, I support Black Lives Matter, for example. And the disconnect between the two is really something that I'd like to see more work being done on and highlighted too. So those are two things that I would like to study,
Yeah.
pursue.
Uh,
Yeah.
you mentioned that this kind of racialization and racism is always met with uh, resistance and really, in some cases, struggles to survive. Could you reflect a little bit more on like forms of resistance that we're seeing today that are always already being encoded as terror and extremism?
Yeah, so I mean, I think now is a really interesting moment about resistance because we're seeing in the United States and particularly in this work that I'm doing as the director of research for the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, I've been able to be in different spaces than I would as just an academic, and really seeing that there's a lot of advocacy work that has been, I think, maybe kind of started after 9/11, but certainly Trump mobilized in this country, because of his overt anti-Muslim racism. So, we're seeing coalition building between different orgs. So people who are, making some connections between, the hyper surveillance of Muslims protesting in this country, so not just today, but like 2016 to like 2020. I think, I think even my daughter made a comment like, how many protests are there? It's like, and, there was a protest for immigration, for climate change, for Black Lives Matter. So as a result of this, what we've seen is the government really use some of these counterterrorism policies to crack down on protesters. And so we are seeing resistance to some of these counterterrorism policies as a result of, all of this, mobilization that's been going on in the United States for over the last like 7 or 8 years. In India, for example, there were a group of Muslim women who, after there was an attack by the Indian state at a Muslim university of students there. And several Muslims were killed, and they were called terrorists and are detained and arrested. And so Muslim women, these are mothers, some of them are working, are coming and sitting and blocking off a street to protest, this act by the Indian police and the Indian state on these students. And so that's also something that I think is very important when we talk about policing and resistance to policing or surveillance, is that gender is really important here, because in a lot of the resistance that I've been seeing or noticing, a lot of it is women led, and women organized. So Black Lives Matter is an example of that in the United States. And so in this case in India, like, women were bringing biryani and blocking off the street for several months. It's called Shaheen Bagh. If you look that up, you can see that that was resistance to the hyper surveillance and policing of Muslims in India, young Muslims in particular. And so I think that's always important to know that when people are racialized, when you're racialized, that part of your identity that's being attacked, you recognize how much you want to protect it too. And so that pushes people, I think, to resist when something is being attacked on them. There's a resistance to that. So I think we are seeing in this moment, coalition building. We're seeing, the younger people really, saying no, I'm not, so for example, another, informal form of resistance is when COVID was at its height. George Floyd was murdered in the United States, and people were intentionally covering their faces, but not just because of COVID, but because they knew that they were being surveilled, by the state. So um, I always say, these policies are expansive. We need to pay attention to these policies. They need to be uncovered, and we do need to dismantle them. I am not an advocate of expanding them in the United States. I'll hear people saying after the January 6th, attack on the Capitol, let's call them terrorists. And I'm like, no, let's not call them terrorists, because the minute we call them terrorists, we start putting more money into our counterterrorism policies, which we know ultimately will be used against racialized groups. But I do think that we're also seeing some awareness and resistance to this as well, which is important. Yeah.
Yeah. I was going to ask if you could reflect a little bit more on counter-terror policies and laws and the intersection with university spaces. Like, I think
Yeah.
lots of profs and students think, oh, I'm protected by academic freedom, or there's no security intelligence uh, assets in our class. That would be weird. But uh, can you say a little bit more about the depth of the integration there?
Yeah. So, you know, um, this is something that we need to be very, very mindful of, right? So I will say this one, in this moment of protests in the United States, which I'm in Boston. So mind you, I was on campus last semester. I just started my leave this semester. And um, when the students started protesting in October, November, um, there was a day of, I don't remember if it's called the Day of Rage, but there was this, sort of fear mongering happening that Hamas was going to commit some kind of attack and, in the Day of Rage. And universities in Boston, for example, were being encouraged to participate with the Boston Fusion Center. And the Boston Fusion Center is a counterterrorism center. Now, the difference between like the Boston Police Department and the Boston Fusion Center is when it comes to fighting terrorism, there's a lot less accountability on the state, so they can do a lot without us knowing what's happening because, there's so many cases in the United States that have gone up to the Supreme Court where the state is protected because the Supreme Court will say, well, if it reveals any national security, anything to do with national security, it could be a threat. So we won't allow this transparency or whatever to happen. So in that moment, like, Brick is collaborating with campus police, campus security, in case there's this potential terrorist attack, which wasn't, we don't even know that this was a real threat. So, I was on campus, and I was fortunate that my institution was they reached out to me as one of the very few Muslims on campus, and then I studied this, and I said, don't do this, because actually what happens is not only, are they surveilling, do they have the potential to surveil, right, your Muslim students, it's actually your undocumented students too, who are very much at risk of threat when it comes to, because Brick has been known to go into a Boston public school and detain and deport an undocumented who was not Muslim, but they said he was quote unquote potentially a gang member, So this is something that I think, you have to be very, very careful about in this moment where, what is a real threat? How is your institution collaborating with police or policing, and particularly any kind of counterterrorism? Because your vulnerable students, the most vulnerable, become the most vulnerable when you invite them to your campuses to do this kind of work. So, and unfortunately, with so many protests, we're seeing more of this being utilized to actually deal with protests by the government. So something to be aware of.
Yeah, I think it's a similar situation in Canada, not to the same extent. We don't have formalized fusion centers, or they're not called that per se, but there's connections between security intelligence and public police, and mobilizations for pro-Palestinian solidarity have really been a focus of a lot of that work in the last uh, 5 months. Uh,
Yeah. And that's what 9/11 really, really did in the United States. And Canada haven't really, everybody thinks Canada is ideal compared to some of these other, and maybe it's just a lot better, but you're starting to see some of the stuff. But what 9/11 really did was make the sort of uh, information sharing a lot easier between federal, state, local, and even private companies. So private companies are now becoming a part of this as well. So it's that, sharing of information that didn't exist or wasn't quite as, it wasn't, easy to do, but now this is, what's happening is we're seeing this. And then now including, because of the student protests, including campus police into this is really quite frightening, yeah.
yeah. Maybe one last question, not to keep you too long,
Oh,
but
no.
I find it kind of disturbing that quite a number of my undergraduate students have no understanding of the war on terror,
Yeah.
or that they don't realize that the monumental shift in law and policy around the world that it has created. So, as an educator, uh, what is kind of like one or two of the main ways you think we can raise awareness about the effects of the war on terror for people who are just kind of entering university or taking social
Mhm.
science classes for the first time?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's really interesting as I've been teaching, so I actually taught a class called the War on Terror. And I co-taught it with a colleague who's a political scientist who taught the war on drugs. And so you're right, like the war on drugs really resonated with them, same students in both of our classes. The war on terror, like there was silence for most of the first part of the semester because they were so afraid to talk about it because they had no idea, and so this is a generation like, when I taught, over a decade ago, some of them slowly they're forgetting, they're so young now. Now they weren't even born until after 9/11. And so when I tell them I used to be able to go to the airport and meet my guest at the gate and there was no security, you walk in, and they're like, whoa, that's wild, because they have no reference point to this. So they really don't know. They're being raised in this surveillance society, really. And I think there's a part of them that I wonder, and I don't know empirically if, like, social media and the sort of, I'm sort of in between, like, are they just okay with, the levels of surveillance they put themselves, in the, they're really giving away all their information in a lot of ways through social media and things like that. And then they're not aware of, like, what life was like prior to 9/11 and, prior to the global war on terror. So there's part of me that's like, well, it's, through education, it's through race scholarship, it's through, making them aware of, I mean, we really, for me, ultimately, I want them to disagree with these counterterrorism policies, to not accept them blindly. But then on the flip side, I have a 16-year-old, and I'm seeing that she's learning things on TikTok that I was like Said's work. I know it's not like she's read Said, and she should still read Said. I would always say you have to read him, but there's something else happening, and I think it's tied to the sort of younger generation showing up, right, in this moment, where 10, 15 years ago, even 3 years ago, I don't even know, 5 years ago, like when it came to, like, just the pro-Palestinian protests, we would not have seen this like this. So I think while they may not understand all of the laws and policies of the war on terror, there is a percentage of this population that I think is getting some information via social media like TikTok that is making them aware. Like, I met my friend's son, who is a college student in Texas, and he was talking about Angela Davis's work. And I was like, oh, so you read her in school? And he's like, no, TikTok told me to read her. It's like, okay, so I think it's both. I think they're not aware of some of it. And I think on the other hand, they're getting some of this through social media, which is creating this population, at least what I'm seeing on college campuses around here, of students who are actually somewhat more savvy. Then, like I said, they're wearing masks to avoid their surveillance. So there's something happening here too that's somewhat, it's hopeful as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thanks so much for going through your work with us today and providing your perspective. And again, being courageous to do this work in the face of this kind of surveillance that often uh, tries to suppress scholars and this kind of scholarship.
I have no choice. I feel like like this impacts me very personally, right? But I just really appreciate you inviting me to speak here today. It's really an honor to be here and meet you in person. So yeah.
Good to meet you. Yeah. And if anyone in the audience wants to, please order uh, these following books: Forever Suspect, Racialized Surveillance of Muslim Americans in the War on Terror. I actually have a few copies in my office if you're at Winnipeg and you want to borrow one, as well as A Global Racial Enemy, Muslims and the 21st Century Racism, Muslims and 21st Century Racism. So, yeah, thank you again so much for taking the time to share your work.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Okay, take care.
Bye.